Hornby's Centenary, 100 years, and they're looking for a birthday celebration. But they've challenged me to do something a little bit different. They want a cake, but they also want it to be a layout that kind of shows off the Hornby products. That's quite a challenge. That's probably why they came to me. Well, let's see what we can do for them.
Happy, 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 happy birthday.
British summertime has visited us, so I do apologise for the sound of the rain. But what I've got here is the very bottom board of this build. It's 3 feet by 3 feet, and that will accommodate the Hornby 00 on the bottom. That's kind of our datum point. And I've just started cutting the strengthening pieces that are going to just brace this piece of wood. Once I've got the outer layer of those as a square around the perimeter of this 3x3 board, I actually want to cut out the middle piece. I want the very topmost tier of the cake, in inverted commas, to come from this, and that will allow that we'll have an overlap between the different tiers, which in turn will mean that it just makes it a little bit easier to build. It'll all come clear as we put this together, but it will also allow access up the middle for wiring as well, which is also pretty useful. So I'm going to get on and screw these pieces together. What I'm doing at the moment is I'm working out the tiers on the cake in inverted commas. The very top level is going to be a real cake, but I need to work out how big the discs that I'm going to be cutting need to be, and this is where you only really get one chance, simply because measure twice, cut once. I'm going to be trying to get the diameter of these by actually using, I've found the centre by drawing corner to the corner. I've put a screw in, and then by tying a piece of string I can fasten a pencil to the other end, and that will then give me a way of drawing the outline of each of these discs that I need to actually cut out. But I need to make sure that each tier is wide enough that I can lay track around it and run trains on it, but narrow enough that we don't end up with just what would look like a splat. So it's a fine balance between the two, and I'm trying to decide whether I want the tiers to be coming in 6 inches on each level or coming in 8 inches on each level. Now my preference would be for 6 inches, but it's whether that actually leaves enough space for the track and a train with clearance to get round all of that. So it's actually quite a tricky thing to work out. I'm just about now to cut the middle bit here. Now you may be wondering why...
Oops, sorry, I knocked the camera.
Okay. I'm just about to start cutting out the first of the tier plateaus, and what you may be wondering is, why is there 2 big boards? Now the reason for this is, when I cut these rings out, if I cut them all out of the same board, there'd be no overlap, and that makes the construction a little bit more difficult, and it's harder to actually hide any mistakes if I cut any of these rings ever so slightly out of shape. So by taking out the middle one here, it actually gives us excellent access up through the middle of the cake from underneath, so for things like wiring. But it also means that we can more easily build the construction with some short pieces of wood, and it's all going to go together just grand, I hope. So I'll be marking this one up and cutting out the slightly larger ring and the smaller ring as well, and that will all go together and give us a pretty good tiered cake. Fingers crossed. But what I'm doing now, I've drilled some pilot holes, and I've put the bracing underneath this board just all the way around the outside, and I have checked that in the most extended, the blade from the jigsaw does not hit my lovely flooring. So it does mean I can hopefully cut this with impunity in here without worrying about damaging the floor, which is obviously very important. So with these pilot holes drilled, I've just done these with my battery drill, hopefully that now means that the actual blade, and it does, can go through, and then I'm going to follow round this pencil line that I did with the length of string and the pencil. So I'm going to get to it now. So this will be the tier that goes 2 tiers up. I've got to cut the next one that goes underneath, and from the middle of that one that I'm going to cut out for there, we'll do the one that goes on top. So as you can see, it'll become kind of wedding cake style is what we're aiming for. And hopefully it's starting to come clear what my grand master plan is. So what I'm doing now is, because I've cut out the hole, I'm in a position where I can start to fit a cross bracing piece that would have otherwise been very much in the way when we were cutting. I've marked out the next few tiers here, so you can see by using the 2 separate pieces of plywood I can get a generous overlap, and this really helps with the construction. That's going to become quite clear later on, and it really is surprisingly easy to mark these out by scribing in the intervals on each side. So I've got a little bit of a guide of where I'm aiming for, getting the string to the right length and then drawing in those circles, all from this centre point with this temporary screw that's put in there just to mark the centre. But we're all done with that and we're ready to start the cutting. So let's get rid of that, put some temporary supports underneath so I can use that jigsaw to start the cutting out, and then we'll have all of the components that we need for this build. So imagine lots and lots of completely the same short lengths of this, about approximately that long. So we're just going to cut it up and cut it up, and then we'll have a big pile of them, and I'll be able to glue and screw them onto each of these tiers to hold the tier above up, and then onto that tier will go the next tier, and it'll just build up almost like a big sandwich. I'm going to get these cut out now with the jigsaw, and then from there it just becomes an industrialised process of taking one of these lengths of 2x1 and just cutting it into equal short lengths that will effectively be the piers that hold each one of these tiers up from the last. Around the edge will be thick card, which will just staple gun on, but the actual structure inside will be that. And it's a bit of a boring process, but we just churn a whole load of them out and then we're ready to start construction, and we're not continually stopping to cut little bits of wood, which always derails a build process. What I've actually made here is a template. I measured really carefully to make sure that this is exactly the right length that I need. And then as I'm cutting these individual pieces, I just rest that on top, up to the end, make sure everything is square, and with the disc not spinning, I just carefully line that up and then I can cut. I've got all of the rings cut, and I have to apologise at this point for the typical British summer weather going on. It's decided to rain, and because we're doing this in a conservatory, it is quite loud, but you're just going to have to bear with us on that. So I've got each of my tiers, and at the moment they're completely flat. And actually the bottom one, you can see, is the ring where I cut the top one from, which gives us some of that access through. And what I'm going to do is these that have been very carefully cut to the right height will become the piers that this is supported on. And that will then go on there. It will have a strip of card around it that will make this look like a solid cake tier. And then we go again on the next tier up. And then again for the final tier at the top, and there'll be a cake in the middle of this. And on each of these tiers I'm going to lay track, and there'll be a train going round. So you can see here the way each of these tiers overlaps slightly, and we can do this because we cut them out of 2 pieces of wood. If we hadn't have done that, if we'd have tried to skimp and made them all from the same piece of wood, then we wouldn't have had this overlap that you can see these piers are able to sit on, and it would have made the construction so much harder. I'm roughly working out how many of these piers I need, and then I just loosely place this on top, and this is the clever part. This is where what I'm going to do is I'm going to screw each of these piers into place flush with the edge, and then once they're all in I can lift this off as one. I can glue the bottom if need be, and then turn all this over and screw in from the other side, and that will make this really, really strong. What you can see here now is pretty much the entire construction in place. So we've done all of the major woodwork. The top tier is yet to be fixed, so you can see exactly how each of these tiers is put together. So what I'll be doing is once the glue is set on this tier, I can screw it from underneath. I've already drilled little pilot holes, so I know exactly where those screws need to go, and then I can do exactly the same for this tier, and that will go on there. I've carefully measured the way in from the edge, so I knew exactly where to locate these, so they should be pretty much centered. And then there's going to be a cake on the top here. I think it's going to look absolutely marvellous once it's done. What you've got to imagine is we're going to have thick card that will be bent round to form a full circle round these. That'll be staple gunned and glued in place. It'll all get painted up, so eventually this will look like one huge birthday cake. And of course we're going to be having the trains running around each of these tiers. They're going to have to be quite small, as we explained right at the start, to be able to get round these tight curves, but they're going to represent Hornby products from through the ages. The whole thing's now screwed and glued together, and it's not desperately heavy. I can pick this up just fine. One person will be able to carry this around, but it is super strong. Now the next stage, I want to start getting some coats of paint on it. I've got some cheap white paint, and I'm going to use that as if it's an undercoat. I'm not really too bothered about just slapping it on. The idea is that by the time the Humbrol paints arrive, I want a good coat of smooth white paint to act as that undercoat and to hide the fact that this is actually just made of wood. So it'll give that smooth kind of finish that you'd associate with an actual iced cake. Well, it's the end of day one of this build, and actually it's come together an awful lot better than I was actually anticipating. I'd set aside 2 days to be able to do the woodworking, and it's complete in one. And what that's meant is that I've been able to get the first coat of the white paint on, and I'm using this as an undercoat. You may be wondering why I've not actually painted the very bottom layer, and the reason for this is actually quite simple. My plan is to use a kind of grass paper. It's a brown packing paper, but it has very short, about 1mm static grass already stuck to it, so it gives a really good green, almost like a beige effect. And I'm going to use that to cover the very bottom layer, so it looks like the cake is sat on a plinth that's got almost like a slightly furry, grassy texture, and that's what the Hornby 00 layer is going to be laid onto for running. But now all that's left to do today is to clean the paintbrush and let this dry. As the week progresses, I'm back at work, but I'm going to try and stop off every evening and just put another coat of paint on, build up that white layer, and it will disguise all of the wood grain and make it actually a very smooth, great primed surface for the Humbrol paints when they arrive. Just doing a quick test fit of the card that Les dropped off for me. It's been pre-cut with a guillotine to be the right height, so I'm just testing, and it's going to take just over 1 to do the top tier, so I'm guessing I'm going to need 2 for each tier, maybe 3 for the bottom one, but you can already see the basic design of the cake taking shape. So put that there. It's going to be fastened on using the staple gun and some glue around the bottom. Yeah, I'm pretty pleased actually. That does look like it's going to be just what the doctor ordered. But first of all, what I've got to do is start the painting process. The white paint, I used that as an undercoat to give me a good basis for painting with the Humbrol enamel paints. Now the thing about these is they're actually geared up for painting things like plastic model kits. So when you're painting onto something like wood, which is a little bit porous, has a slightly more rough texture, you will go through an awful lot if you don't undercoat first, and that's what I've done. So in terms of colours, we're going to have the red on the top tier, so that'll be the top platter and the sides, and then we're going to go for yellow for this tier, for the top and sides, and then finally we've got a blue, and I'm going to start painting with this blue, but in all honesty I think that's too light, so that will probably get overpainted with a slightly more royal blue type colour. So just going to use that as a placeholder to give us an idea of what the whole thing's going to look like, and it'd be quite easy to one coat overcoat it at a later date. What I've also got to do with the card, I think the best way to do these, because I want a really sharp line between each colour, I'm going to paint the bottom inch or so on each of these in the appropriate colour, let it dry, and then when I come to fit these, they'll be ready painted at the bottom so that we get that nice crisp line between the two colours, and then I'll go over them again and paint up and cover up things like the staples, which will be holding them in place at the top. And then hopefully when it's all done, it will look nice and smooth and actually like an iced cake rather than something that is crafted out of plywood and card. So I'm going to get on and I'm going to start some of this paint work. So first up actually we're going to give these a good shake because they've been hanging around, and then once we get them open I'm going to give them a good mix with the paintbrush. And I've also got a little bit of white spirit, and what I'm going to do is, if needed, thin them down just to get some better coverage. First coat of all three colours on now. We used those Humbrol paints. It's gone on really well actually because we used the white as the undercoat, but then I've got to let them dry and harden off, and then the plan for next is get those side pieces on. They'll go on with a staple gun. I use some paint to hide those staples and just tidy everything up as well, and then we really are motoring on. I'm preparing now to add the green grass at the bottom, and for this I'm going to be using the kind of grass paper that you can buy in bulk, and it makes a really good basis for when you're doing grass on a layout anyway. But I'm going to just use it in its native form. I'm not going to add anything to it, and it'll look more like the kind of fake grass maybe you see at the greengrocers. And I think that that'll go together to really set off the multicoloured, vibrant aspect of the cake itself. I want whichever side I start on to be the front, and the reason for this is because I don't want any seams in the grass. So I think I will I'm going to make an executive decision, and I'm going to make that other side the front. And the reason for this is because I've got a few little splodges of blue paint has managed to get in the yellow. I've overpainted them, but if we make this the back, then nobody's going to see them. So just going to turn this around. I also want to blow some of the dust off. And then see what we can make with this. Sure that this sticks really well, so what I'm going to do is just be quite liberal with this glue. Effectively the staples are actually just to hold it until the glue sets, and then any staples which perhaps look a bit unsightly and are visible, I can actually just pull them straight back out. First part of the green done, and then we'll just work our way in strips around the full width of this, and when we're done the bottom layer will have this green slightly grassy texture, which is just what we want, and then we can move on to putting the side pieces in. The first strip of the grass mat is in. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get on and get the rest of this in. I'll do it strip by strip, matching it up to the last strip that we put in. And it's just a case of working systematically, making sure you don't get any wrinkles, working from one side to the other so we can smooth them out. It's going to be tucked in underneath the structure. I'd rather go all the way in underneath there and not end up with any kind of a gap when the side pieces are put in. They will come just as soon as the grass is done, and then we can really start to build this cake up and we'll see it for all its glory. But this job isn't going to get done if I sit around here talking to you, so I'm going to get straight on. So another day comes to a close. There's still a lot of paint that needs to dry, so we're going to just leave that now overnight, and that should harden off. But the main focus of this evening has been the grass layer at the bottom. As I said before, I've gone with that grass mat. I'm not actually going to add anything much to this because I want it to just look like a grass mat that you might have laid a toy train out on when you were younger. Something like Hornby 00 was famous for being on this huge, completely flat green board, and that's the effect that I want to go for the bottom layer. We've still got these side pieces to go in, and they'll go in tomorrow when all the paint's dried, but really now you're starting to see the finished product come to life. overnight to dry, so we're back again. It's still raining, it's typical British summertime, but I've done all the grass and I'm just doing a test fit of the lowermost level of track. This is the Hornby 003 rail, so I'm just generally working out where to put it. That's not fixed yet, because what I now need to do is take that back off and we're going to start doing the side pieces, and this is really where it all comes to life. This is vintage Hornby 003 rail track. There's a bit of a knack to putting it together, it has to be said, but once you've got that knack, it's actually quite easy. But I've done a test fitting, I know where the track is going to go, and what I want to do now is just take all of this track back off so that we've got a clear run for doing the side pieces. Also, this track's a little bit oily. I'm going to have to clean that up because what I don't want is to get dirty marks on this grass. So I'm going to start at the top, and as we talked about before, it's about deciding where the front of this is and where the back is going to be, if only because when we staple gun the card bits on, I don't want a seam down the front. I'm going to try and keep all the seams towards the back. So let's see, what's the best side on this? I'm thinking possibly, I'm going to say, doesn't really matter I guess. Actually, we're going to make that the front. I'm going to make an executive decision. And these are the card pieces that we made up yesterday. So all this paint is now dry. So what I want to do is to just going to try bring this round. What I'm going to do is where this upright is, I'm going to use that as the join point, because then we've got this vertical piece of wood which we can staple gun to. So I've got my staple gun and we are committed. Right, they are now on. So now I've got to bring this round. Will staple gun all the others, but just for now I want to make sure there's another vertical upright here. This is the piece that I prepared to go in that gap. I didn't know precisely how long it needed to be, so I've kind of over painted this length, and that's going to go into there, round to here. So what I need to do is to make sure that I can just cut that down there. I'm going to do that very, very carefully, and then we'll have a piece that will fill that gap, and then the top tier is just done waiting that touch up with the paint. I've got all the vertical side pieces on now, and actually this really changes the way the whole build looks. Up until now I've been worried that it looked a little bit Heath Robinson, you know, just thrown together, cobbled together out of any old bits of rubbish that was lying around. But now it actually does look good. I must admit to myself that this actually looks like something that somebody competent actually built. But no, really, you can now see the kind of effect that I was going for from the start with this tiered cake effect. Now the cake has arrived for going on top, but I'm not going to put that there until all the paint is dried, otherwise it's just going to get contaminated with paint fumes and it's not going to be a nice cake to eat otherwise. And anyway, I've got track to lay. I'm going to start off with the lowermost level with that Hornby 003 rail that I showed you a little bit earlier on. Now I'm going to clean up this track first so that when it goes down it's going to actually be nicer, neater. And then that's got to get fastened down, it's got to be tested, and once I'm happy with that layer I'm going to move to the next one up, the next one in. Now the next level is where it's going to get interesting, and the reason for this is we're using flexible track, so I'm going to have to kind of fiddle it in. I'm going to have to cut it to the right length and make sure that everything runs well with no weird kinks or anything. So it's going to be tricky still, but I think that what we've got here really shows that we mean business with this build. With this Hornby 003 rail track, it's actually quite easy once you get your head around how this is working. We've got the electrical tabs in the middle, and you have to make sure that they connect but don't ride up and actually short out to the base. It's an acquired knack, but once you've got it, it's quite easy. And then it just pushes together. And it does actually stay together reasonably well. What I'm doing now is I just sorted out the right size of screws just to fasten down the 3-rail track. Normally I'd use brass panel screws, really tiny ones, but they're actually really difficult to get hold of at the moment. So I've resorted to these, and it's just simply a case of rummaging in my big box of screws for the right ones. And then it's drilling time. This is the track I'm going to be using. It's the Hornby flexible track. Now it comes in 1 yard lengths, and I'm going to have to get quite creative with this because we're going to be flexing it down to well below radius 1. But we can do that. I've tested before that actually if you get a really short wheelbase locomotive and rolling stock, then they are quite happy going down some really tight curves, just so long as you don't get buffer lock. What we've got here actually is the cake that's been made for this. I'm just going to very carefully open this up, and there she is, the very top layer of this cake. And this is a real cake that we can slice into and eat, and we'll possibly get some candles on there. Not quite 100, I think 100 candles, we might as well just set fire to everything. But that's going to be absolutely great. We're going to leave this here for now. Top level is going to actually be a bit tricky, and I think that what I'm going to have to do is just basically pick the shortest wheelbase locomotive in the Hornby range, and it will just be going around on its own. It's not going to be able to pull any rolling stock, but that's fine. I think it's all going to work out just right. The lower levels, they're not going to be as tight, so I think we've got a little bit more flexibility with what we can run on them. I'm on with the track laying. I'm up to the yellow level, and I'm starting from the bottom, working in, and of course as you go the track gets tighter and tighter, and quite frankly the blue was just about going beyond radius 1, but the yellow is, if there was a radius 0 or a radius -2, it's there. So I'm not looking forward to the red one. That is really actually going to tax the track to the absolute limit of what you can realistically bend it to, and then the hunt is on for something that will actually go round it. So let's just play things by ear and see where we get to. But I think this is going to be a very, very interesting build. It's certainly something very different, and I'm hoping that Hornby like this. On these layers I am trying to get it to follow the edge of the wood. I didn't on the blue because I think it's a little bit more forgiving, but certainly here by having it right at the edge, then it will give it the best possible chance of a train going around. And I'll do the same on the red as well. It'll also help to hide these screw heads because the track will be straight over the top. We hit upon a snag with the build, and it's something that I suspected might happen. And essentially, when you try and flexible track down and down and down, it just won't do it. So the top tier of this build is just too tight on the track. I can just about get the track to bend, but there's no way of joining it, and it's literally pinging rail chairs left, right and centre and coming apart, and it does look to be too tight for anything to realistically go around. So as a change of plan, what I am going to do is I'm going to load up the top tier around the cake with an assortment of Hornby locomotives, and that will be the next best thing. So all that's left to do now really is to wire it up electrically and test it. I am a little bit worried that the track is too tight for most of what I've got planned to go around it, but I'm sure that we can work something out. I'm starting to wire up the track now. We've given up on putting track on that top tier, it's just not feasible, but I do need to wire up and test the other layers. So I've drilled some holes, and they've gone in just there and then also around here. And these ones down at the bottom, I've already fed some wire through. I just want to solder that wire to the rail. And this is twofold. Firstly, we get a really good electrical contact. But also secondly, I don't want these wires getting pulled from underneath and just disappearing into the structure. So soldering them in just makes them nice and firm. That does actually go round with its full train on that. I'm very surprised and very impressed. I didn't think that the couplings would allow it. It's struggling ever so slightly where the track joins are, but it is making it round. At the moment what I'm actually doing is doing some servicing of a Hornby 003 rail locomotive, which I want to try and to get running. But as you can imagine, these are very old, and it's safe to say that they're well past their prime, which does mean that it might take a bit of coaxing to get this thing running properly. I think it's safe to say that actually what this locomotive needs is probably new brushes. Just running it in one place, it's a really good way of getting a locomotive running and to just clear any gunk out. So by holding it in one place I can keep an eye on it, make sure all is well. Now what I'm going to do with this is try and change the carbon brushes in there. They are arcing quite terribly. I do happen to have all of the spare parts from 20 years ago when these were still getting used at exhibitions, so I may have some carbon brushes. But I do have some carbon brushes. buzzing like an angry bee, but it now does work. I had to remove the points. What I'd forgotten about 3-rail is that when the pickup skate crosses over the point work, it creates a momentary short. Now, of course, with old-fashioned controllers, they took this into account, and they're actually quite forgiving, but modern ones, not really quite so forgiving. So I've had to take those points out, plain lined them, just to give it a chance. I've cleaned out the commutator and the armature windings. I did that with some white spirit, and I've also replaced the brushes too, because they were looking really quite worn down. And all in all, it seems to be working, but it is struggling. What you've got to remember is that this is a 60-plus-year-old model train. We've finally got the build sorted. I've got that Hornby 00 locomotive working. That's going to be running on the bottom line. I've picked the W4 packet for the next line up. For the top line, what I really want to do is to see if I can get the Centenary rocket running. Now, this isn't very forgiving of things like really tight corners. We might not be able to get that working, but I do have an assortment of other things, other products from throughout the Hornby range, old and new. Also got classic Hornby 00 boxes. That really does take me back. But I'm going to set dress this now, get it all decorated up, get the cake on top, and then we're going to have something special. Now that we've got it running, what I want to do is to start to decorate. Each of these tiers has space for products. So I've got an assortment here, and I'm just going to start putting them out, spacing them around, making everything look pretty. And I'm going to give that one pride of place, because that is the model that got me back into railway modelling. Final touch, the cake. There we are. And let's redecorate. What are those? Well, Hornby, challenge was accepted and delivered. I think this is the perfect centenary birthday cake.